Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of our Curators at Work series. While the museum is closed for renovation and many of us are working from home, staying at home with social distancing, the museum has moved most of our programming online. So we're delighted that you could join us over the internet today. And please be sure to check out a whole host of other online programs on our website, virginiahistory.org. There are lectures, behind-the-scenes programs, educational programs, movie myth-busting nights, and so forth. So there's a lot of great stuff on there. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today, but especially our members. The VMHC is a nonprofit private organization, so we very much rely on the support of members and other supporters. So thank you very much for your generosity. I am Karen Cherry. I'm one of the curators at the VMHC, and I have the maybe perverse pleasure of talking with you today about smallpox. I just want to mention before we get going a couple of things. First of all, there are a couple of yucky looking images on the picture. In the slides, there's an image of a patient with smallpox and a couple of illustrations of smallpox. So if you don't like to see that kind of material, you might want to close your screen. The other housekeeping note I have before we get started is that for the Q&A portion of the presentation, please enter your questions on Facebook or YouTube. You can do that at any point through the conversation or through the presentation during our Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those as we can after my remarks. So without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation, which is called Stamping Out Smallpox, the History of the First Vaccine. And as we enter the second year of dealing with the global COVID-19 pandemic, it seems like kind of an opportune moment to look back at the history of other infectious diseases. I wanted to talk about smallpox because there are many parallels, as you'll notice over the course of this talk, between smallpox and the coronavirus and how societies dealt with it. Also, smallpox is ultimately a success story because it has been eradicated. So in these days when we're all struggling to stay vigilant, to deal with the hardships, struggles, and deaths that the globe has experienced during coronavirus, I hope that this history of smallpox gives us a little hope about what the future might hold. So today's talk, we're going to explore the history of smallpox and how humans beat it. So let's go ahead and move to our first slide. My slides are not advancing. There we go. There we go. All right. As I say, throughout this talk, you'll probably notice some parallels between our current pandemic of COVID-19 and smallpox. Now, the story of smallpox, which was called the scourge of the species, it is a highly contagious and deadly viral disease that had been plaguing humankind for millennia. It is very deadly with mortality rates usually ranging somewhere between 20 and 60%. So on average, about 1/3 of people who were infected with smallpox died. Those mortality rates are especially high with young children. In the 20th century alone, smallpox killed an estimated 300 million people. So that gives you a sense of its scope. And if you were lucky enough to survive smallpox, you were often left with disfiguring scars. Very often, you were also left blind. About a third of the people who caught smallpox ended up going blind. And as you can see from these two images, one of the characteristic symptoms of smallpox are a series of first pustules and that then dry to scabs that cover the body, particularly around the face and eyes, but then down across the rest of the body. So it was a really pretty horrific disease. Yet, as I said, it's also a major public health victory for the world because it is the only human disease that has been completely eradicated. And the fight against smallpox, the fight to eradicate it, helped establish certain scientific and health protocols that have been applied to fighting other infectious diseases like measles, the flu, coronavirus, and so forth. So it really is a very important story in the larger history of the fight against infectious diseases. So let's look at the history of smallpox a little bit. We don't know for sure, but we think it's been around since at least 10,000 before the Common Era. So as I say, it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. It appeared in ancient Egypt. At the top left of the screen, you'll see the mummified skull of Ramses V, one of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And his mummy shows the scars of smallpox. So we think that he may have died from that disease. There's also evidence of smallpox in Europe by around the year 500. It appears in ancient Chinese texts from the 14th century, ancient Indian texts from the 7th century, and from those various places, smallpox spread around the world. It's very much a story of human movement. Because smallpox is infectious and it passes from person to person, when people moved around the globe, they took smallpox with them. So when various countries went to war or went on exploratory expeditions and started traveling the globe, they often took smallpox with them. And because of that, smallpox was incredibly devastating in the Americas, in North and South Americas, which really hadn't experienced smallpox until Spanish and Portuguese and later other European explorers and settlers came to the Americas and brought smallpox with them. And because the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas had never experienced smallpox before, they had no immunity to it. And so smallpox really decimated the native populations of North and South America. Smallpox helped contribute to the fall of the Aztec Empire in Mexico and the Incan Empire in Peru. It also, because it decimated probably at least a third of indigenous populations, it kind of laid the groundwork for colonization and settlement of the New World. So as smallpox spread around the globe, it continued to afflict populations through the centuries up until 1980, when it was eradicated, when smallpox was virtually gone, essentially gone from the face of the earth. So how was it eradicated? How did humans slay what was also called the spotted monster? And that's what we're going to turn to now. And there are two key phases in the fight for smallpox. The first part has to do with variolation. And variolation is a form of inoculation using the smallpox virus. And this is a technique we don't know for sure when it originated, who originated it, but we think that the Chinese were using it perhaps as early as the 1st century, definitely by the 10th century. Variolation was also used, practiced in Asia, in the Middle East, and Africa by the 1700s. And what people who used variolation noticed was that if you survived smallpox, you would never get infected again by smallpox. And so they started inoculating people by taking samples of smallpox, usually scraping out a bit of liquid from a pustule or scraping off a bit of a dried scab, and then inserting it into the body of the patient you wanted to inoculate, either by cutting into the skin and then inserting the smallpox under the skin, or by inhaling it through the nose. And generally, you would take the smallpox sample from someone who had a very mild case of the disease, because the patient who was inoculated would develop smallpox, and the hope was that if you started with a mild case of the disease, that the patient would similarly have a mild case, then survive it, and then be immune to smallpox. Now, humans didn't really understand virology, what a virus was, how immunity was built up in the system by reacting to the presence of that virus in the body and developing antibodies and so forth. They didn't understand those until modern medical developments in the late 19th and 20th centuries. But through observation and practice, they recognized that variolation was a way to help protect people against smallpox. As I say, Asia, the Middle East, Africa had been practicing variolation by the 1700s, but it wasn't known in Europe until the early 18th century. And the woman pictured on the right side of the screen, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, was a key figure in transmitting knowledge of the practice of variolation to Europe. She was a noblewoman, a poet, and also the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And when her family was stationed in Constantinople, then present-day Istanbul in Turkey, she learned about the practice of variolation. And she had, as a young woman, suffered smallpox, survived it, but she was terrified of her children catching it. So she learned about variolation, and in 1718 decided to have her son inoculated. A couple years later, in 1721, she was back in England, and she started telling her influential friends, doctors, scientists, and even royalty. And so she helped spread the word about variolation, convinced the royal family to get inoculated, and became a lifelong advocate for the practice of variolation. Beginning in the 18th century, the practice of variolation spreads throughout Europe. And then from Europe, it moves to the British colonies in America. And a really interesting piece of the history of variolation involves an enslaved man named Onsimus. We don't really know much about his life. This is just a generic painting of a Black person. It's not meant to be a portrait of Onsimus. We know very little about him, except that he was kidnapped, captured from Africa, and brought to Boston. By 1706, he was enslaved by the Reverend Cotton Mather, Puritan minister who's perhaps best known for his involvement in the Salem witch trials. Onsimus had known about variolation from Africa. So when there was a smallpox epidemic in Boston, Onsimus told Cotton Mather about the practice. So here we have an instance of technical medical knowledge being transported from Africa to America through the international slave trade. Enslaved Africans brought other knowledge as well, certain farming practices, ironworking technologies, and so forth. Well, they also helped bring variolation to the Americas. And through the knowledge that Cotton Mather gained from Onsimus, they were able to help combat an outbreak, an epidemic of smallpox in Boston in 1721. And through the success of that, word spread throughout the colonies, and the practice of variolation followed. Benjamin Franklin was an advocate. Several Virginia founding fathers were as well, including Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson traveled to Philadelphia as a young man in 1766 to get inoculated by variolation. George Washington, he was a smallpox survivor. He had caught smallpox at age 19 while he was traveling in Barbados. He recognized the strategic value of variolation pretty keenly during the Revolutionary War, after the American forces were soundly defeated during an attack on Quebec. And a large reason for their defeat was that so many soldiers had been either killed or laid out by smallpox. Recognizing that problem, George Washington declared in 1777 that all soldiers in the Continental Army should be inoculated by variolation. Now, variolation was a very controversial practice, pretty much from the beginning in both Europe and America. And you see pro and anti variolation factions develop because variolation involved infecting a healthy patient with smallpox. People who were opposed to variolation were afraid that that patient would die from smallpox. They were also afraid that the person who was infected, the person who was inoculated, would infect others in the community and lead to a smallpox outbreak. Also, the variolation process, because you're transferring biological matter from one person to another, there was a risk that you could transfer other diseases as well. And again, people didn't understand the biology of that, but through their observation, they noticed that some diseases, in addition to smallpox, were passed along by variolation, diseases such as syphilis and other things. And some also opposed variolation on religious grounds. They felt any attempt to stop a God-given disease was a counter to God's will. So there was a lot of controversy surrounding the practice of variolation, even though its mortality rates were far lower than if you had smallpox without variolation. 2% mortality rate from the smallpox that you got through variolation versus about 30% mortality rate if you just develop smallpox naturally. So the people who supported variolation, they very much embraced its protective measures that led to lower mortality rates. Now we see the controversy over inoculation erupt in Norfolk, Virginia in 1768 and 69. There were actually riots, and I'm not making this up. And during this period, there were small epidemics of smallpox in Williamsburg, in Yorktown. So citizens of Norfolk were on edge about the epidemic coming to their town. Well, one resident, a Dr. Archibald Campbell, he decided to engage the services of Dr. John Lesh to inoculate Campbell's family and neighbors. And he probably learned about Dalyesh through, contacts in the medical community, also through an article that Dr. Dalyesh had published in the Virginia Gazette, elencating the details about the disease and also hyping his own services as an experienced inoculator. So Dr. Campbell hired Dalyesh to inoculate himself, his family, and a group of their neighbors. Well, other citizens were very upset about this because they were afraid that the inoculation process would lead to an outbreak of smallpox. The anti-vaxxers, I'm going to use a modern term, the anti-vaxxers tried to get the local magistrates to stop these plans. The magistrates didn't want to step in. So these anti-vaxxers, they basically fired up a mob that marched to Dr. Campbell's home, broke windows, set his house on fire. They did the same to the home of Dr. Dalyesh. They also forced Campbell's family to march off to the pest house, the kind of quarantine hospital that was set up to deal with smallpox outbreaks. And tensions erupted the following year as well. So we had 2 riots in Norfolk involving the same group of people in 1968 and 69. And charges were filed by both the pro and anti-inoculation sides. The cases were tied up in courts for years. Interestingly, when he was a young lawyer, Thomas Jefferson represented the pro-vaccination party in this. Well, these riots also led Virginia's General Assembly, the House of Burgesses, to pass a law in 1770 that prohibited inoculation unless you got a special permit from the local magistrate. And that effectively stopped the inoculation process in Virginia. In 1777, the General Assembly revised that law to allow inoculation if the majority of your neighbors within a 2-mile radius agreed to allow you to inoculate, and also if you maintain proper quarantine. So these debates in Virginia led to legislating over the status of inoculation and the ability to practice variolation. So now let's pull back to a broader picture, back from Virginia and what was going on in Norfolk in the late 1760s to the world stage again. And here we come to part 2 of how humans eradicated smallpox. And this brings us to vaccination. Vaccination, unlike variolation, which used a bit of the smallpox virus and inserted that into the body of the patient so that patient would build up immunity to smallpox. Vaccination was a form of inoculation that used the cowpox virus rather than the smallpox virus. And the cowpox virus, that is related to smallpox. They're all part of the orthopox virus family. But cowpox, as the name suggests, generally only manifests in cows. And when humans get cowpox, it's generally not deadly, and your symptoms are much milder than they would be with smallpox. There are 2 different viruses. Cowpox is called vaccinia. Smallpox is called variola. Now, an English country doctor developed the practice of vaccination using the cowpox virus. So he's a key figure in this part of stamping out smallpox. He, as a country doctor, noticed that women who worked as dairymaids, as milkmaids, they generally didn't get smallpox. So that got him to thinking about taking the practice of variolation, but instead of using smallpox, using cowpox. And it's a story that involves a cow, a dairymaid, and a gardener's son. It sounds like a little bit like the cast of, a Baroque farce or something like that. But Dr. Edward Jenner, he collected the cowpox virus from, one of his cows, Blossom, a cow by the name of Blossom, that cow transmitted cowpox to a dairymaid named Sarah Nelms. And then Dr. Jenner took a sample of the cowpox virus from the pustules, from the poxes that Sarah developed, transferred the cowpox to his subject, to his patient, a young boy named James Phipps. And there's a modern image kind of imagining what that scene looked like. This happened on May 14th, 1796. Dr. Jenner conducted this experiment with his new process. He waited until James came down with cowpox, but he had a very mild case of it and he fully recovered. And then in July of 1776, Phipps infected James with the actual smallpox virus. James did not come down with smallpox. So Jenner concluded that James was now immune to smallpox. And again, James didn't necessarily understand the virology of it, but because these two viruses, cowpox and smallpox, are related, cowpox provides crossover immunity to smallpox in humans. And with further experiments, Jenner was able to perfect his practice and published his findings in a book in 1798 that started to spread the word about this new practice of vaccination. A quick note about the term vaccination. It comes from vaccinia, which is the Latin word for the cowpox virus. And that itself is derived from the Latin word for cow, which is vacca. And the way I'll be using it today, vaccination is distinct from variolation because vaccination involves immunizing someone with the cowpox virus rather than the smallpox virus. And until the late 19th century, vaccination as a term was used specifically to describe immunization with cowpox. But in the late 19th century, that term became applied more broadly to all kinds of immunization products. But for these purposes, in the context of smallpox, I'm going to be using it to describe vaccination with the cowpox virus. Now, in his 1798 book, which is titled An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variole Vaccine, Dr. Jenner outlined his process. He also expressed hope, quote, that the annihilation of the smallpox, the most dreaded scourge of the human species, must be the final result of this practice. And because of his experimentation and his codification of this process of vaccination, Dr. Jenner is widely recognized today as one of the founding fathers, if you will, one of the founding fathers of the field of immunology. And his discovery would have a profound impact on the world. As the practice of vaccination started to spread, it also churned up some of the same controversy that surrounded variolation. People met this practice with the same skepticism, concern about introducing infection into a healthy patient. You can see that some artists took the fear of, or exploited the fear around vaccination for satirical purposes. This is a satirical cartoon from 1802 that shows Dr. Jenner standing in the center, inoculating a woman. And his other patients who've already received the vaccine are manifesting all kinds of crazy symptoms. You see, they have cow heads and other parts of cows' bodies bursting out of their limbs, out of their nose, out of their face, just bursting out of their body. So this cartoon artist is playing upon people's fears and skepticism of this new practice of vaccination. Despite the controversy, many people did support the practice of vaccination, and Jenner's ideas started to spread beyond England into Europe and also to America. And a Boston doctor, Benjamin Waterhouse, who was a professor at Harvard, he was a key figure in bringing the practice of vaccination to America. Dr. Jenner, who originated the vaccine, he passed it on to one of his fellow doctors, Dr. Haygarth, who then passed it on to the American doctor, Benjamin Waterhouse. And Waterhouse brought it back to Boston and started to not only practice vaccination, but to spread the news about it and to share samples of cowpox with others, including Thomas Jefferson. These two men knew each other, and Dr. Waterhouse convinced Jefferson to try vaccination in Virginia. Kind of a somewhat unfortunate aspect of this is that Jefferson agreed to do so, and he tested it out on 3 of his enslaved people. He took them as his guinea pigs for the vaccination. But based on that success, Jefferson ended up vaccinating more than 200 people, including members of his family, his neighbors, and his enslaved workers. Jefferson, who had been a proponent of variolation, became just as strong an advocate of vaccination and spread word of the practice throughout Virginia and also to others while he was in Washington, D.C. as president. Just to give you a sense of Jefferson's admiration for Dr. Jenner, he wrote to Dr. Jenner saying to him, "Yours is the comfortable reflection that mankind can never forget that you lived. Future nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox had existed and by you has been extirpated." That would not come true until later in the 20th century, but already in 1806, Jefferson recognized the profound impact that the smallpox vaccination would have in wiping out what had been such a scourge on the human race. Now, by the 1840s, vaccination had largely replaced variolation, and doctors started carrying the tools for vaccination as a standard part of their medical kits. Various communities set up vaccination clinics throughout the 19th century. Anti-vaccination efforts persisted. In 1879, the Anti-Vaccination Society of America was established and ran various efforts to try to stop communities from setting up these clinics, from mandating vaccination. There were lots of debates about whether vaccination should be compulsory. Such debates went all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1905 upheld the constitutionality of mandatory vaccination laws passed by states. The court said you could do it if it was for public health. So as despite any opposition, vaccination efforts really started to explode in the 20th century. They ramped up, especially as technological developments in the production and delivery of the vaccine made the whole process much more efficient. And here on the slide, you just see a couple of artifacts showing how widespread vaccination was becoming. Here's from the 1930s, a Chicago Department of Health poster reminding people to get vaccinated. The photograph shows federal employees getting their smallpox vaccination. So, and by the 1940s, Virginia and other states required that students have that vaccination before they were allowed to enter school. So we see more and more Americans getting the smallpox vaccination, such that by 1952, smallpox was eradicated in the United States. The following year, it was also eradicated in Europe due to the wide-scale vaccination efforts. And public health officials also decided to take the campaign global. And the World Health Organization, it started to do that in the 1950s, but it really committed to these efforts in 1967 to a global eradication campaign. Now, in 1967, the disease was still present in 31 countries, and it was killing an estimated 2 million people a year. So it was still a major global health problem, even though it was starting to be eradicated in some parts of the world. Well, as a result of that massive campaign, 1977 saw the last natural case of smallpox. A man named Ali Malin in Somalia caught it. He survived, but he was the last known case of someone who naturally caught smallpox. After his ordeal, in 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated. Now, smallpox is still the subject of medical interest. Even though it has been eradicated, the world cheered, everyone patted themselves on the backs. This horrible scourge that had killed tens of millions of people over the course of thousands of years of history, had been wiped off the face of the planet. It's still a subject of medical interest, particularly in the context of biological warfare and terrorism. There are fears that surviving samples of the disease, if they get into the wrong hands, if they somehow get out of their secure locations, they could be weaponized and turned against the human race, or create a new pandemic because people are no longer regularly getting smallpox vaccinations, so people are not immune to it anymore. By international agreement, there are only 2 stores of the smallpox virus in the world. One in the U.S. at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and another at an analogous organization in Russia. There's still testing going on with new vaccines. Again, just in the event that a worst case scenario happens and somehow smallpox gets reintroduced into the world. I now, for a few more minutes before we open it up to Q&A, want to turn to a few artifacts in the VMHC collections that are related to the history of smallpox. We don't have a lot, but we do have images about the introduction of the vaccine and the controversy and skepticism it was met with. These are analogous to some of the satirical cartoon I showed you. And in the lower right, which is a French print the triumph of the smallpox, you see the speckled monster shown as this female kind of sea monster type figure covered with the distinctive red spots that were characteristic of smallpox. We have images related to the fight against smallpox, the treatment of it. Here's a picture of a hospital in London that was constructed for quarantining of smallpox patients and the delivery of the vaccine. A postcard at lower right shows a vaccination effort at Camp Lee here in Virginia as soldiers are lined up out the door waiting to get their jab. We have items such as this one in the collection, which is a page from a photo album with portraits of Maryland volunteers who served in the Confederate Army. And the one page has their photos. The second page gives notes about the fate of the men pictured, these Maryland volunteers. And the circled man was John Craig Lake. And as the person who kept this album noted that he died from smallpox in 1864, even though both federal and Confederate armies tried to require vaccination, they didn't always have the means to deliver on that requirement, so smallpox continued to ravage both armies during the Civil War. In the 20th century, we see that if you wanted to travel internationally, in addition to packing your passport, you needed to take a certificate of vaccination, such as this one that belonged to Ludwell Kimbrough. And the yellow document is his international certificate of vaccination, and it indicates that in February 1960, he got his smallpox vaccination. Also, lots of letters in which Virginians talk about the various ways in which they experience smallpox. In this particular letter, it's from a Confederate soldier named William Wyatt. He was writing to Mr. and Mrs. Sam Baker in Hanover County. He was stationed in Georgia. He wrote this letter to them in November 1862, in which he talks about how the smallpox was scattered through the country by soldiers returning from the army. And I was vaccinated yesterday, though it may be too late to do any good, for I may have with it somewhere on the road, for I met and traveled with a great many sick soldiers. I shall be uneasy for several weeks. So he's expressing his fear that he himself might come down with smallpox because he was traveling around with soldiers, moving from place to place, and he got exposed to smallpox. He was vaccinated, but he's not sure if he was vaccinated in time. This is a letter that really resonates with some of the current debates we're having about mask mandates, about getting the coronavirus vaccine and so forth. This letter is a draft of a letter to an editor from a Dr. Robert John Preston, who was in Abingdon, Virginia. He wrote this in 1876. He wanted the newspaper to publish this letter, which made in very strenuous terms the argument for vaccinating. And Dr. Preston wrote, "This is a loathsome disease, and the appeals here to humanity are often loud and strong, and the criminal neglect appalling." He's talking about officials who won't mandate vaccination. Are our public authorities sufficiently aware of their duty and responsibility under the law in these cases? And are they sufficiently prompt and energetic in putting into effect the means to prevent needless suffering and death? We think not. So he's kind of expressing his frustration and distrust with local authorities. The final object is a letter from William Massey. He was writing from Richmond to his father, Henry Massey, in Charlottesville. This letter dated January 29th, 1876. It included a little piece of paper, which you can see on the right side of the screen, that was was folded up and pinned to the inside of the letter. And when his father opened the letter and opened this little enclosure, he would have found this, a smallpox scab. And William wrote to his father saying that he basically was sending his father a scab so that his father could inoculate members of the family. And William wrote to his father, Henry, Dr. Harris says the piece I enclose, the scab, is perfectly fresh and was taken from an infant's arm yesterday, but that you must let him know whether it takes. And if it does not, he will send you another scab, continues. Dr. Harris says the enclosed scab will vaccinate 12 persons, but if you want more, you must send for it. I will pin this to the letter so that you cannot lose it as you did before. Actually, much of the letter, William is expressing frustration with his dad because he had sent an earlier sample and his dad lost it. So William is very adamantly, telling his father, don't lose this one. I'm pinning it to the letter so that can't happen. So this was a scab that William got from someone who had developed cowpox, that mild form of a related virus to smallpox, and he was sending it so that the scab could be used as the basis for vaccinating his relatives in Charlottesville. Now, for those of you who are longtime visitors to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, if you saw an exhibition we had on view in 2011 called Bizarre Bits, you would have seen this letter and the little smallpox scab on display. This was part of an exhibition we did about kind of unusual items we have in the collection. And I think a scab sent along with a letter to be used for vaccinating against smallpox certainly classifies as a bizarre bit. Well, an employee of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, happened to be visiting the museum in May of 2011, and he saw this scab. And he was concerned that if the scab was somehow still infectious, and if it was a smallpox scab, that it could create a public health emergency. So this CDC employee notified his bosses, and they sent a representative down to the VMHC. And I wasn't at the museum at the time, but I kind of imagine it like the scene from E.T. when, these hazmat suited goons come sweeping into the museum, covering everything with plastic and wearing their protective gear, biohazard suits and so forth. It wasn't actually like that. That's just how I imagine it in my mind. But the CDC staff, they came to the museum, they took the scab off exhibition, they confiscated it, which they have the authority to do for an infectious disease like smallpox, and they took it back to their labs in Atlanta. They were just wearing gloves and a lab coat, not full-fledged hazmat suits. But they did test the scab, and they found that it contained the virus used for vaccination. So it contained the cowpox, not the smallpox virus. Nevertheless, just to be absolutely safe, they did irradiate the scab, just to kill anything that might be lingering in it. And this is how the museum got it back from the CDC. We got it back in this little plastic tube. So it's back in our collection in storage. We store it along with the letter, the original letter from William Massey that he sent to his father along with the original scab in the hopes that he would protect his own family against smallpox. So that is the end of my formal remarks on the history of smallpox and the ways in which humans were able to stamp out, to eradicate this deadly and devastating disease. So I'm happy to take your questions. Again, please add your questions into either Facebook or YouTube, your platform, and let me turn to your questions. I have a question. It is my understanding that viruses were not known specifically in the 18th century. So use of that word is a modern usage. And yes, that's correct. As I mentioned, people from observing knew that you could pass diseases like the bubonic plague, like smallpox, like other diseases. They knew that they got transmitted from human to human, but they didn't understand the medical science behind it. It wasn't until later in the 19th century, with the development of germ theory, with the development of medical equipment that could look at these pathogens on a genomic and anatomical level, did they really understand how a virus works? But I was using our modern understanding of virus, just for clarity's sake here. So thank you for that question. Another question: how did the dairymaid get the cowpox? Well, milkmaids and people who worked closely with cows would often pick up cowpox from the cows themselves. Like smallpox, cowpox is an infectious disease. It can jump from cow to human. Cowpox can, smallpox can't. Smallpox is limited just to humans. But because smallpox and cowpox are related, the cowpox vaccination provided cross immunity for smallpox. So presumably Sarah Nelms, the dairymaid that Dr. Jenner used in his experiments, she caught it just simply from her day-to-day work, from being in close proximity with cows, milking them, sending them out to pasture, and so forth. Let's see. Questions about the Massey letter, the Massey story. Did Massey ever use the scab to inoculate his family? We're not sure. Because we have the scab, the suggestion is maybe he didn't use it. But we can't be sure, because maybe it was a larger scab and he scraped off part of it and got what he needed to inoculate the other members of his family. We just don't know. We don't have the records that tell us one way or another what happened with the Massey family. Although they didn't, around this period, there weren't any who died of smallpox. So perhaps indeed they did use parts of the scab, but enough of it survived to come down to us to be preserved in our collections with this letter. Let's see. Are there different variants of smallpox like there are for COVID? If so, was the cowpox vaccination effective against all the variants? Yes, there are, and I should have prefaced this entire talk with a caveat that I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have that level of medical expertise. If there are any doctors in the audience who want to chime in with maybe more specific and precise answers, please do. But I do know that there are two variations of variola, which is the smallpox vaccination. There's a variola major and a variola minor. And the variola major leads to much more severe outbreak of the disease, much more severe symptoms, a higher probability of death, whereas variola minor causes much more mild forms of smallpox. So there are two versions of the smallpox virus, and the vaccination based on the cowpox virus is effective against both of those. Let's see. There is another question that I'm sorry, I just don't have the medical expertise to answer. Someone is asking if the vaccine for chickenpox is similar to the smallpox vaccine. I don't know genetically if smallpox is related to chickenpox. I know smallpox and cowpox are. They're both orthopox viruses, but I don't know if chickenpox fits into that or if it's another species of virus entirely. But I do know that the general premise of how vaccinations work, that you infect a healthy patient with a virus that prompts a response from the immune system that then builds up immunity to protect the patient against that virus. I know that that basic concept of vaccination, that basic process, has also been used in the chickenpox vaccine. I just don't know if those two viruses are genetically or biologically related. All right, I think those are all the questions we've gotten. I hope that looking at the history of smallpox, I hope you found learned some interesting things, not only about the disease of smallpox and the ways in which it was eradicated, but I hope you also found interesting the many parallels to our current situation of dealing with a highly infectious disease at the time of a global pandemic. And I know that the coronavirus vaccines are controversial for some of the same reasons that the smallpox vaccines were. Regardless of your position on that, I hope that you all stay healthy and well, and that maybe, a future curator 20 years or so from now will be able to give a similar talk about stamping out COVID-19. So let's hope for that. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you participating in our virtual programs. Please check out virginiahistory.org to find out about more of these kinds of events. And again, do stay well. Thank you very much. Bye now.